A widow stood alone in the freezing dark, and the wind did not care. It came from the northwest, the way cold always comes, not slowly, not gently, but all at once, like a decision already made. She stood at the edge of what the land office had called her property, and she looked at the structure in front of her. 12 feet by 14. Walls cut from the earth itself, 3 feet thick, packed with dry grass and old roots. A single window facing south. A door that hung slightly crooked on its iron hinges. A roof of willow branches and tar paper that had already begun to sag on one side. This was not a home, not yet, but it was the only thing she had. Her name was Astrid Voss. She was 29 years old. Her husband Henrik had died of fever 6 weeks after their ship reached the New World. 3 weeks before she ever saw this land. He had spoken of it the way some men speak of heaven. Open skies, honest soil, a place where a family could build something that would last longer than one life. She had believed him. She still believed him. That was the part that hurt most. She turned back to look at her children. Lena was 6, and she stood very still the way she always did when she was thinking hard about something. Her small face was serious, her eyes moving slowly across the soddy walls, the crooked door, the yard of bare frozen ground. Emil was 3, and he was already trying to climb the wheel of the wagon because Emil was always trying to climb something. Storm, the old dog they had collected 3 days earlier from the roadside, thin as a winter branch, sat between the children like he had always been there. Lena looked at her mother. Then she looked at the soddy again. "Mama," she said, "is this our home now?" Astrid did not hesitate. She had promised herself she would not hesitate, not in front of them. "Yes," she said, "and we will make it worthy of that name." She said it quietly, the way her own mother used to say difficult things, without drama, without apology, as if the saying of it made it already partly true. Lena considered this for a moment. Then she took Emil's hand and led him toward the door. Storm followed, and Astrid stood there alone for just a breath longer, looking out at 160 acres of frozen grass that stretched to the horizon with nothing to interrupt it. No tree line, no ridge, no sign that any human hand had ever worked this land, before she turned and followed her children inside. The interior was dim and smelled of cold earth and something older underneath, like wood ash and long-closed air. A cook stove stood in the corner with its door hanging from a single hinge. There was a shelf along one wall, empty. A dirt floor, cracked in 2 places from the summer heat. The south window let in a pale rectangle of winter light that reached just far enough to show Astrid everything she had to work with. She set down what she was carrying and looked at what she had. A small amount of money, just enough to matter, not enough to solve anything. 2 horses, both old, both thin from the journey. A broken stove. Blankets. 3 changes of clothes for each child. A Bible that had been Henrik's, its margins filled with his handwriting in the careful script he had learned from his own father. Enough food for perhaps 3 weeks if she was careful. Seed that wouldn't be useful until spring. And 4 months until that spring arrived. She lit the lantern that first night and sat at the small table she had built from boards off the wagon, and she did the arithmetic. Not because she wanted to, because not knowing was worse than knowing. Coal cost more than she had. The nearest timber was more than half a day's ride, and the trees there were green cottonwood, Old-timers said it burned wet and threw sparks and gave off barely enough heat to justify the effort. Even if she could cut it, she had no one to help her haul it, and her horses could not sustain the trips that would be needed before snow made the road impassable. She could twist hay into tight bundles the way desperate homesteaders sometimes did, but twisted hay burned fast and hot and left nothing behind. You could spend an entire day making fuel and burn through it in a single night. She was still sitting there, still looking at the numbers, when she heard it. A sound, light, deliberate, from beneath the floor. At first, she thought it was an animal, a mouse in the walls, a rat under the boards. But it came again, and this time she understood what it was. The sound of paper, old paper, shifting. She moved the table. She found the loose board, third from the wall, slightly higher than the others, warped upward at one end. She lifted it, and in the shallow space beneath, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept out the worst of the damp, she found a folded piece of paper. The writing was faded but legible, in a language close enough to her own that she could read most of it. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and held it in both hands. She did not understand it yet, not fully, but she tucked it into the front cover of Henrik's Bible, behind the first page, where she kept the things that mattered most. And she told herself she would come back to it. She did not sleep that night. She lay on her side with Emil curled against her back and Lena pressed close to her front, and she listened to the wind working at the corners of the soddy, and she thought about Henrik, and she thought about the paper, and she thought about the 4 months between now and spring, and she thought about the arithmetic that had no good answer. Just before dawn, Storm got up from his place by the door, turned twice in a slow circle, and lay back down facing northwest. His ears were flat. His breathing was steady. But something in the set of his body had changed. Astrid noticed. She didn't know yet what it meant. She filed it away alongside everything else. The cold, the arithmetic, the note, the name she had given this place in her mind that she had not yet spoken aloud. Home. 3 days after she arrived, a man came by on horseback. He was older, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of face that has been weathered past the point of expression. He had survived more winters in this valley than most men tried. She had heard his name already from the land office clerk. Silas Greer. A man people listened to, because Silas Greer had earned the right to be heard. He did not dismount. He looked at the soddy. He looked at the broken stovepipe. He looked at the children playing near the wagon and at Storm watching him from the doorway. He looked at Astrid the way men sometimes look at problems they have already solved in their heads. "You have no timber," he said. "No. No coal. Not yet. No money for coal." He said it without cruelty. That was the thing about Silas Greer. He was not a cruel man. He was an honest one. On the plains, those two things could look exactly the same. Astrid did not answer. He already knew. He looked at the children one more time. Then he looked back at her. "A woman alone cannot cut enough timber," he said. "You will freeze, and those children will freeze with you." A pause. That is not a warning. That is arithmetic. He touched the brim of his hat. He turned his horse, and he rode back down the trail without another word, leaving only the sound of hooves on frozen ground, growing smaller and smaller until the wind took even that away. Astrid stood at the door of the soddy and watched him go. Then she went inside, put another scrap of wood into the broken stove, and began to think. because Silas Greer was right about the arithmetic. She knew that. Every number she had run said the same thing, but arithmetic assumed you only used what was already there. And somewhere out past the fence line, in every direction she could see, the dead stalks of 1,000 wild sunflowers stood taller than a man, dry as bone, waiting for nothing. She was still watching them when Lena came to stand beside her and slipped a small cold hand into hers. "The earth holds heat," the note had said, "if you let it." She didn't understand it yet, but she was beginning to. The first frost came without warning. One morning the grass was still pale gold, bending in the wind the way grass does when it remembers summer. The next morning it was white, not the deep white of a real snow, just a thin crust of ice that caught the early light and turned the whole prairie into something that looked, for just a moment, almost beautiful. Astrid stood in the doorway of the soddy and looked at it. Then she looked at the wood box beside the stove. 3 pieces of scrap timber left, enough for 1 fire, maybe 2 if she fed it carefully. After that, there was twisted hay she had bundled the week before, enough for perhaps a day. After that, there was nothing. She had 3 matches, not 3 boxes, 3 matches. She had counted them the night before in the lamplight, turning each one over in her fingers like they were made of something precious, which they were. She went inside and made the fire. She fed the children first, a thin porridge of dried corn and water, sweetened with the last of a small jar of molasses she had been rationing for 2 weeks. Emil ate with the focused seriousness of a child who does not yet understand scarcity. Lena ate slowly, watching her mother's face the way she always did, reading it for information that Astrid was careful not to give. Storm got the heel of yesterday's bread, soaked in water to soften it. He ate it in 2 bites and looked up at her with eyes that asked for nothing more. She appreciated that about him. After the children ate, Astrid sat at the table and did not eat. She had not eaten a full meal in 4 days. She told herself it didn't matter, that the body was resilient, that she had felt hunger before and survived it, that one adult could go without far longer than 2 small children. All of this was true. None of it made the hunger go away. She just learned to stop listening to it, the way you learn to stop listening to a sound that never stops. She had 7 weeks, perhaps 8, before the real cold arrived. The kind of cold that didn't just bite, it swallowed. She had heard the old-timers talk about it. She had seen it in the way Silas Greer had looked at her children when he delivered his verdict. 7 weeks was not enough time to cut and haul timber from the river valley. It was not enough time to earn the money for coal. It was barely enough time to do anything at all, unless. She looked out the window at the dead sunflower stalks. She had been looking at them for days. The stalks from the previous growing season stood in thick rows along every fence line and in every low place where water collected in spring. Some were as tall as she was. Some were taller. Their heads had long since dropped and scattered seed, but the stalks themselves remained dry, rigid, stripped of everything soft by months of wind and sun. She had burned a handful of them the week before, experimentally, feeding them one by one into the stove. They caught easily and burned hot. Too hot. The fire roared up and was gone in minutes, leaving behind almost nothing. A wisp of ash, a brief warmth, and then cold again. Too fast. She needed slow. She thought about what her grandmother used to say about the bogs back home, how the men would cut the peat into bricks and stack them to dry, and how those bricks would burn for hours, steady and deep, because the peat was compressed. Dense. No air inside to let the fire race. What if sunflower stalks could be made dense? She broke several into short pieces and packed them into the firebox as tightly as she could manage, pushing them together until there was no space between them. The fire was harder to start, but when it finally caught, it lasted nearly 15 minutes instead of 3. Still not enough, but different. The principle was there. She needed pressure. The next morning, she bundled the children warmly, left Storm to watch over them inside the soddy, and walked 3 miles through cold that hadn't yet made up its mind to be serious. She was going to see Widow Brandt. Widow Brandt had come from somewhere in Northern Europe a long time ago with a husband who had died, as husbands on the plains often did, of something that should not have killed a strong man, but did anyway. She had stayed. She had learned the land with the particular stubbornness of a woman who has no other option and decides to make that a virtue. Her farm was small and worn but functional, and her eyes, when she looked at Astrid, had the quality of someone who had survived long enough to recognize survival in others. "You want to burn weeds," she said. It wasn't a question. Pressed made dense. Widow Brandt looked at her for a long moment. Her hands kept moving, kneading dough on a board scarred from years of use, the motion so practiced it required no attention. "You have seen this done?" "No." "Heard of it?" "No." "Then why do you believe it will work?" Astrid thought about the 15 minutes. About the compressed stalks glowing orange instead of racing white. "Because it burned differently when I packed them tight. I just need more pressure than my hands can give." Something shifted in Widow Brandt's expression. Not quite belief. Something older than belief. A kind of recognition. She wiped her hands on her apron and tilted her head toward the barn. "There is a press," she said. "My husband used it for cider. The wood is cracked. If you can repair it, you may borrow it." The press was worse than described. One sideboard had split clean through, and the screw mechanism had rusted solid. Astrid spent 3 days repairing it, working in Widow Brandt's barn in the mornings, while a neighboring bachelor named Halverson, a quiet elderly man with too much silence in his house, watched the children. 3 days of labor for a machine that might not work at all. On the 4th morning, the screw turned. She started small. Broken sunflower stalks, chopped to the length of her hand, mixed with a little mud to help them bind. She packed them into the press box and turned the screw until the mechanism groaned and the stalks compressed, not into powder, not into loose material, but into something with weight and density and edges that held their shape when she released the pressure. She let the first bricks dry 2 days in what weak sun there was, turning them twice. Then she brought one inside and fed it to the stove. For a long moment, nothing happened. The edges darkened, but didn't catch. Her throat tightened. Then the glow spread inward. The flame took hold. And the brick burned. Slowly, steadily. The heat building in layers the way real fuel builds. For nearly 45 minutes. Astrid sat back on her heels and put both hands over her mouth. 45 minutes. From one brick the size of her 2 fists together. If she could make enough of them, if she could make enough of them before the real cold came. She went back to work. It was on the 2nd day of hauling sunflower stalks that she met Aldwin Holt. He was 32 and farmed 80 acres to the northeast, inherited from an uncle, and worked with the confidence of a man who has never had to question whether he belongs somewhere. He rode up while she was loading cut stalks into her wagon, covered in pollen and chaff, her hands already blistered from 3 days of pressing. He looked at the stalks. He looked at the small bricks drying on a canvas in the wagon bed. His expression moved through several stages before settling on something between skepticism and irritation. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Gathering fuel." "That is not fuel. That is weeds. It burns. Everything burns." He said it the way men say things they consider obvious. "Paper burns. That doesn't make it fuel." Astrid kept loading stalks. "It burns for 45 minutes per brick, longer if you feed them right." He dismounted and walked to the wagon. He picked up one of the dried bricks and turned it over in his hands, knocking it against the wagon side, frowning. Then he put it down with the careful deliberateness of a man returning something he has decided is worthless. "Even if that's true," he said, "you're wasting time on something unproven. Chips are free. Twisted hay works well enough for most people. You could earn enough before the snow for a month's worth of coal and work on the rest after. Chips burn too fast. Hay burns faster. I've run the numbers." He gave her the look she was coming to know well, the particular expression of a man confronted with a woman who knows something he doesn't. Somewhere between skepticism and something that looked almost like unease. "I've seen women try stranger things," he said from his horse now, looking down at her. "None of them worked. That's not cruelty. That's experience. You'd do better to listen to Silas and find a way back while you still have the option." Astrid didn't watch him right away. She already knew what the dust behind him looked like. She kept loading stalks until the wagon was full and her shoulders burned, and then she drove back to the soddy and started pressing. 2 weeks later, Aldwin Holt rode past again. This time he slowed when he saw the wall. She had begun stacking the dried bricks against the south side of the soddy, out of the wind, in the sun, where they could continue to dry and where she could count them easily. The wall was waist-high now. 300 bricks. Maybe more. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at the smoke rising steadily from the chimney pipe. Then he rode on without saying a word. That same week, Rupert Fenn came by for the first time. Fenn operated the coal supply in the nearest town, buying from the railroad at one price and selling to desperate homesteaders at another, whatever the season would bear. He had built a comfortable life on the principle that winter made everyone afraid, and fear made people pay. He was a well-fed man on a well-fed horse, and he looked at Astrid's wall the way a man looks at something that threatens to be inconvenient. He did not dismount either. "That won't work," he said without greeting. "Good morning," Astrid said. He ignored it. "Whatever you're calling those, they won't heat a soddy through a hard winter. I've been in this business long enough to know what burns and what doesn't." "Have you tested them?" He smiled. It was not a kind smile. "I don't need to test things that can't work. I know fuel." He looked at the children playing near the fence line, Lena lining up stones in some private arrangement, Emil knocking them down as fast as she placed them, both of them apparently content with this as a game. "My concern," Fenn said, "is that you're giving other people ideas, telling them these bricks work as well as coal. I haven't told anyone anything. People see me working, that's all. And what will they see when the cold comes and those children are suffering? He gathered his reins. What will they see when you come to my supply shed in the deep of winter, looking for credit you can't repay? Astrid looked up at him then, at his clean hands, at the horse that had never gone a day without grain, at the certainty in his face that sat there like furniture, like something he'd inherited and never thought to examine. If that happens, she said, you'll have your proof. Until then, you have nothing but a guess. The smile left his face. Something colder took its place. He touched his hat brim, the gesture of a man performing courtesy, and turned his horse back toward the road. I'll see you in the deep of winter, he said over his shoulder. I expect I'll enjoy that conversation. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the press. That evening, she found Storm sitting at the ridge behind the soddy, facing northwest. Just sitting there, very still, ears slightly forward. She called him in for the night, and he came without hesitation. But for 3 mornings after that, she found him in the same spot, in the same posture, looking at the same horizon. She noticed. She didn't know yet what to do with it. The night after Fenn's visit was the hardest night. Not because of the cold she could manage. The brick burning had improved enough that the temperature inside the soddy held steady through the dark hours. Not comfortable, but survivable. And the children slept without shivering, which was the only standard that mattered. It was hard because she sat at the table after the children were asleep, and she did the arithmetic honestly, the way she hadn't let herself do it since the first night. She added what she had. She subtracted what she needed. She looked at the number that was left, and she thought, for the first time, with real weight behind it, what if she left, not gave up? She couldn't make herself use those words. But what if she sold the claim? There were buyers for land, even poor land. Even a soddy with a cracked floor and a borrowed press and a wall of bricks that everyone called foolish. She might get enough. Enough to get the children somewhere warmer. Somewhere with a real roof and a real stove and a winter that didn't announce itself like a verdict. She sat with that thought for a long time. The fire murmured in the stove. Storm's breathing was slow and even from his place by the door. And then Emil, asleep on the low cot, made a small sound and curled tighter. And his small hand opened and closed on the blanket the way children's hands do in sleep, like they're holding on to something invisible. Astrid looked at that hand for a long time. Then she put the arithmetic away. She would not be leaving. The next morning, she went to the sunflower field before dawn and began cutting stalks in the dark. She was still cutting when she heard a wagon coming down the trail. She straightened and turned and saw a man she recognized distantly as Ezra Morrow, a widower who farmed a modest piece of land to the south and who had, as far as she could tell, no particular opinion about her or her bricks. He was perhaps 60 years old, or perhaps older, with the kind of face that stops recording age at a certain point and simply becomes itself. He drove slowly, and in the back of his wagon was something large covered in burlap. He pulled up at the edge of her field and climbed down without hurry, the way old men climb down from wagons when their joints have made peace with inconvenience rather than surrendering to it. I heard you've been using a press, he said. Yes, Widow Brant's, the screw mechanism. He nodded as if this confirmed something. He went to the back of the wagon and pulled the burlap aside. Underneath was a press, heavier than the one she'd been using, built with a lever mechanism instead of a screw, the wood dark with age but solid, the hardware thick and clean. "I made this years ago for something else," he said. "Didn't work for that purpose. Maybe it works for this one." Astrid looked at it. She could see immediately the leverage, the capacity, the way the plate would distribute pressure evenly across a larger surface. She could see what it would do to her daily output. "I can't pay for this," she said. "I'm not asking for payment." "Then why?" Ezra Morrow looked at the wall of bricks against the south side of the soddy. He looked at Storm sitting in the soddy doorway. He looked at Lena, who had appeared beside her mother and was examining the press with the same focused attention she gave to everything. "Because Silas Greer is usually right," he said simply, "and I would very much like to see him be wrong just once before I die." He helped her unload the press. He showed her how the lever worked, how to clear the mechanism when it jammed, how to adjust the tension for different densities of material. He explained it the way people explain things when they have spent a long time learning something and want to make sure the learning isn't lost. Then he climbed back onto his wagon and drove away without asking for thanks. That night, Astrid made 12 bricks in the time it had taken her to make 4. She stacked them to dry and stood back and looked at them. Then she looked at the wall. Then she went inside and told the children tomorrow they would have a proper supper, because tomorrow she would have time to set a trap and check it before dark. Lena said nothing, but she smiled. A small private smile that she turned quickly toward the window, as if she didn't want to use it up too fast. With Ezra's press, the wall grew faster. By the time the second frost came, deeper this time, lasting through noon, she had 400 bricks. By the first week of real cold, she had 600. By the time the grass stopped moving in the wind and simply stood frozen in place, she had passed 800 and was adding to it every day the weather allowed. People noticed. They always notice, in small communities, when someone is doing something that doesn't fit. She heard fragments when she went to the nearest trading post for salt and thread. The Norwegian widow who burned weeds. The woman who thought she knew better than men who'd lived here for decades. Some called her stubborn. Some called her foolish. A few, speaking low enough that they thought she couldn't hear, called her something worse. Aldwin Holt began calling the soddy Folly House. The name spread the way names spread in small places, not because people meant harm exactly, but because a name makes a thing easier to talk about, and people like to talk. Astrid heard the name. She kept pressing, but the days were not only hard. There were moments that caught her off guard, moments she stored carefully, the way you store things that have to last. Lena, who had been teaching herself to read from Henrik's Bible, discovered one afternoon that she could now sound out most of the words. She sat by the stove for an entire evening reading aloud in a slow, careful voice while Emil drew shapes in the dirt floor with a stick, and Storm lay with his head on Astrid's foot, and the fire burned with the particular steadiness of well-made bricks. Emil learned that if he brought bricks from the drying stack to the door every morning, it made his mother's afternoon easier, and he appointed himself to this task with enormous seriousness, carrying one brick at a time in both arms, refusing help, reporting each delivery to Storm as if the dog were keeping count. And Storm himself, the useless old dog nobody had wanted, turned out to have a gift for exactly one thing: knowing when someone was coming before they arrived. He would lift his head from wherever he was resting, ears shifting forward, and within a minute or two, there would be the sound of hooves or boots on the frozen ground. It was a small thing, but on the plains, small things accumulate into safety, and Astrid had learned to trust the lift of his ears. One evening she came in from the press to find Lena sitting beside Emil at the low table. Both of them bent over something. Lena had found a smooth piece of shale by the creek bed, flat, dark gray, the size of her hand, and she had been using a nail to scratch letters into its surface. Practice letters, the same ones, over and over, getting more precise each time. "For my lessons," Lena said, when she saw her mother looking, "so I don't have to use paper." Astrid stood in the doorway for a moment and did not trust herself to speak. Then she went to the stove and added a brick to the fire and kept her back turned until she was sure her face was her own again. Ezra came back the following week. He didn't announce himself. He simply appeared one afternoon with a small amount of rope and a metal eyelet he thought might help secure the press to the ground when the lever created torque. He installed it, tested it, pronounced it better, and stayed for a cup of tea that was mostly hot water with a memory of tea leaves in it. He drank it without comment. He was on his way out when Lena, without looking up from her shale letters, said, "You come a lot." "I suppose I do," Ezra said. "More than you need to." A pause. "That may be true." "Storm likes you." Lena said this as if it settled something. "He doesn't like most people." Storm, from his position by the door, thumped his tail once on the floor. Ezra looked at him. Then he looked at Astrid with an expression she didn't examine too closely. "Good evening," he said, and left. Astrid looked at Lena. Lena was still scratching letters into her shale, the picture of innocence. "He fixes things that aren't broken," Lena said to nobody in particular. Astrid said nothing, but she stood at the window and watched Ezra's wagon move down the trail until it disappeared, and she was aware, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, that she was watching. The wall reached 1,000 bricks on a morning that smelled like metal and distance, the particular smell the air gets when something large is coming from far away. Astrid stood back and looked at what she'd built. It was not beautiful. It was brown and rough and asymmetrical, the bricks varying slightly in size and density depending on which day they'd been made and how wet the mud binder had been. But it was there. It was real. And when she put her palm flat against the surface, she could feel that the bricks on the inside of the stack, the ones sheltered from the wind, were still holding a trace of warmth from the previous day's sun. "The earth holds heat," the note had said. She understood that part now. That evening, Emil brought her the last brick from the morning's drying and placed it in her hand with great ceremony. 1,000, he announced, though he could not yet count that high, and was taking her word for it. 1,000. She agreed. "Are we rich now?" he asked. Astrid looked at the bricks, at the soddy with its crooked door and its repaired stove, and the knotted rope Ezra had strung across one corner so the children had a place to hang their damp things. At Storm, who was lying on his side by the fire with all 4 legs extended, his breathing slow and deep, his tail giving an occasional contented thump against the dirt floor. She thought about the right answer. Then she thought about the true one. "We are rich in what matters," she said. Emil considered this with the seriousness of a 3-year-old processing new information. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and went to lean against Storm's back. Outside, the wind had shifted. It was coming from the northwest now, and Storm, who had been sleeping, opened his eyes. The note had waited under the floorboard for a long time. Astrid had tucked it into the front of Henrik's Bible on her first night, behind the page where he had written their names in his careful hand, Henrik and Astrid, and below that, Lena, and below that, Emil, and below that, a line he had left blank because he had always believed there would be more. She had not looked at the note again since that night. She had been too busy surviving to think about understanding, but on the evening that Ezra came by to check the press mechanism and stayed longer than necessary, she found herself taking the Bible down from the shelf and opening it to that first page, and the note slipped out and fell onto the table between them. Ezra looked at it. Something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly. More like the expression of a man who has been waiting for a door to open. "You found it," he said, "on my first night, under the third floorboard." She looked at him. "You knew it was there." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the dead grass in long, slow waves. Storm raised his head from the floor, looked at Ezra, then lowered it again. "I knew the man who lived here before you," Ezra said. "He came alone, tried to make a go of it. He was not a young man, and the winters here are not kind to men who have no one to share the weight with." He paused. "He knocked on every door in this valley one night when a storm came through faster than anyone expected. Every door." Astrid was still. "No one opened," she said. "No one opened." The fire in the stove ticked softly. Emil was asleep already, one arm draped over Storm's back. Lena sat in the corner with her shale tablet, but her nail had stopped moving. "He survived that winter," Ezra said, "but only just. He left the following spring, never came back. He looked at the note on the table. He told me once that he had written something down before he left. Said he wanted whoever came next to have a better chance than he did." Astrid unfolded the note carefully, the way you handle something that has waited patiently to be understood. She read it again, the words she had read on her first night, that she had not yet fully taken in. "The earth holds heat if you let it. The walls know winter. Trust the walls, and trust the people brave enough to knock." She turned the paper over. On the back, in the same faded pencil, was a drawing. Small, precise. The work of someone who thought carefully before committing anything to paper. A diagram of the Saudi's walls, the cross-section, the thickness, the placement of grass insulation between the inner and outer layers, arrows indicating where cold entered, notes about where to reinforce, a small mark at the south wall where, the drawing suggested, heat from the sun could be captured and held through the night if the wall was built to the right depth. Astrid stared at it. She had built the south wall to exactly that depth, not because she had read this diagram, because she had looked at the existing structure, felt the warmth that lingered there even on cold mornings, and intuited, from something she couldn't name, some inherited understanding of materials and cold and the logic of shelter, that the depth was right. She had done it correctly, without knowing she was doing it correctly, without knowing that someone had figured it out before her and left the answer waiting under the floor. He knew, she said, not quite to Ezra, more to herself or to Henrik, or to the man she had never met who had lived in this Saudi and left her everything he had learned. He knew, Ezra agreed. She sat with that for a long moment. The weight of it was not grief exactly. It was something more complicated, The feeling of being part of a chain you didn't know existed, of having been helped by someone you could never thank. She folded the note and put it back inside the Bible. "The earth holds heat," she said quietly. Motif, memory, instruction, all three at once. Then she looked at Ezra with the directness that had always been her way. "You could have told me about him when we first met." "Yes. Why didn't you?" He considered it. "Because you needed to find it yourself. If I had handed it to you, it would have been information. Finding it yourself, that made it something else." She thought about this. She thought it was perhaps the most honest thing anyone had said to her since she arrived. That was the night the wall reached its full height. And that was the night Astrid began to understand that the note had not just told her how to survive the winter. It had told her something larger about what she was supposed to do with what she learned. Trust the people brave enough to knock. Not just as survival instruction, as a way of being. She didn't know yet how soon she would need that lesson. The morning arrived clear and cold. The sky a particular shade of blue that had no gray in it anywhere. A clean, rinsed blue that stretched from horizon to horizon without interruption. It was the kind of morning that made people want to believe winter was loosening its grip, even when they knew better. Storm did not eat his breakfast. He stood at his bowl, sniffed it once, and walked to the northwest corner of the soddy where the wall met the floor, and sat down facing that corner. His ears were forward. His body was still in the particular way that meant he was not resting. He was attending to something. Astrid watched him. She fed the children their porridge. She banked the fire with 2 bricks and left the damper position to let it breathe slowly through the day. She put on her coat and her good wool scarf, the one she had knitted on the ship, the one that still smelled faintly of salt water if she held it close, and she stood in the doorway and looked at the sky. The blue was wrong. She couldn't have explained it to anyone who asked. It was still blue. It was still clear. But the quality of the light was off. Thinner somehow, like light coming through glass that has been stretched too far. And the air against her face was very still, in a way that felt less like calm and more like a held breath. Storm came to stand beside her. He looked northwest. She trusted him. She left Lena in charge of a meal and the fire. Lena, who was 6 and had been reading the stove's moods for weeks and could be trusted to add a brick and adjust the damper and keep her brother from climbing things. And she went to tell people what she believed was coming. The first house was half a mile north. The family there, a husband and wife, 3 children, a grandmother who sat by the window and watched everything, listened to Astrid with the polite attention people give to someone they have not yet decided to trust. The husband nodded. The wife thanked her. The grandmother watched from her chair without expression. When Astrid left, she could feel that nothing she had said would change their plans for the day. The second house was further. Aldwin Holt's place. He was in the yard splitting wood when she arrived, and he stopped and rested the axe on the block and looked at her with the particular expression he reserved for her. Not quite hostile, not quite respectful, somewhere in the narrow, uncomfortable space between the two. She told him the sky was wrong. She told him Storm had stopped eating. She told him the air felt like something that had stopped in order to become something else. He looked at the sky. He looked at Storm, who had followed her and was sitting 10 feet away, still facing northwest. "It's a clear morning," he said. "Yes." Animals don't predict weather. This one does. He picked up his axe. You've been on the plains for 1 season. I've been here for 11 years. He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. Go home and tend your fire, Mrs. Voss. There's nothing coming today. She went to Rupert Fenn's supply shed next, not because she expected kindness, but because if anyone in the valley had a barometer, it was Fenn. He did. She could see it hanging inside the doorway, a proper instrument in a wooden case. She asked if she could look at it. He let her, with an expression of elaborate patience. The needle was lower than it should be for a clear morning. Significantly lower. She pointed this out. Fenn looked at the barometer, then at the sky, then at her. Instruments have bad days, he said. So do worried women. He glanced at Storm. And dogs. The last stop was Silas Greer. She had saved him for last because she was not sure she had the words for what she wanted to say to him, and because some part of her was still afraid of his certainty, afraid of what it would feel like to watch him look at the sky and look at her and look at the sky again and shrug. He was patching a fence line on the western edge of his property. He heard her out in complete silence, the way he did everything. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking northwest. Something moved in his face, just for a moment. A flicker of something that might have been recognition, or might have been doubt, or might have been the particular expression of a man who has been on the plains long enough to know that it surprises you, even when you think you've stopped being surprisable. Then it was gone. He picked up his tools. The sky is clear, he said. Go home. She went home. She checked the fire, added 2 bricks, adjusted the damper to slow burn. She filled every container she had with water from the well, every pot, every bucket, the old tin that had held molasses, 2 glass jars she'd been saving. She pulled the extra blankets from the chest and laid them over the sleeping cot. She checked that the door latch was solid. She moved the remaining bricks from the outer wall to inside, filling the corner by the stove to a height she could reach. Then she sat down at the table with her children and waited. "What are we waiting for?" Emil asked. "Nothing," Astrid said. "Eat your supper." Storm was at the northwest wall. He had not moved from it in 2 hours. He was not pacing. He was simply there, completely still, his whole body a kind of listening. The change came at dusk. One moment the sky was deepening through its ordinary colors, rose, then amber, then the particular gray-violet that precedes dark. The next moment, something appeared on the northwestern horizon that was not a cloud and not a fog, and not anything Astrid had a word for. A wall of something. Moving. It moved the way water moves when a dam breaks. Not creeping, not drifting, but rolling. A solid mass of compressed air and ice, and something that seemed to have intention behind it. The last light caught its edge and turned it a strange yellow-gray, the color of a bruise in the moment before it fully forms. Astrid was at the door. "Lena," she said. Her voice was very calm. "Come inside." Lena was already coming. She had been watching from the window. Emil was in the yard. He was 30 feet from the door, crouched over something in the dirt. A beetle, a pebble, some small mystery of the ground. And he did not look up when she called. He was 3 years old and fully absorbed, and the sound of his name had not yet reached the part of him that responded to urgency. She ran. The wall hit before she reached him. It did not arrive the way she expected. She had imagined wind first. A gust, a warning, the kind of thing that gives you a second to brace. There was no second. One moment she could see the soddy behind her, its brown walls solid against the dimming sky. The next moment she could see nothing at all. The cold struck like a physical force, not weather, but weight. A mass of frozen air that hit her face and chest and stole the breath from her lungs before she could draw another. The temperature dropped so fast she felt it as a sensation distinct from cold, more like pressure, like something closing around her from every direction at once. The ice in the wind was not snow. It was finer than snow, a crystalline scour that hit exposed skin the way sand hits when the wind is angry, and she could feel it immediately on her cheeks and on the backs of her hands and on the strip of throat above her scarf. She could not see her hands. She could not see the ground beneath her feet. She could not see anything at all except white. White in every direction. White that moved and screamed and was alive in a way that inanimate things are not supposed to be. Emil was crying. She could hear it, thin and high, swallowed by the wind almost before it reached her. But there, she moved toward it. She moved with her arms out and her body angled against the wind, and she counted her steps and moved toward the sound of her son, the way you move toward the only fixed point in a world that has become entirely motion. Her hands found his coat. She pulled him against her chest, felt his small body shaking, felt his face press into her neck, felt his hands grip the front of her coat with the desperate strength of a child who understands, on the most animal level, that this is the hold that saves him. And she turned her back to the wind and walked. She could not see the soddy. She knew the direction. She had lived on this land long enough to know which way was south, even blind, the way you know certain things with your body rather than your mind. She walked. She counted. She kept her back to the wind and her arms around Emil, and she walked. 15 steps. 20. 25. Her outstretched foot hit the base of the south wall. She followed the wall to the door with one hand, keeping Emil locked against her with the other, and she found the latch and pushed, and the door fought her. The wind was already pressing snow against the base, packing it into the gap, but she pushed harder and it gave, and she fell inside with Emil still in her arms and pulled the door shut behind them. Lena was at the stove. She had already added a brick without being told. Her face was white, her eyes enormous, but her hands were steady. "I heard you fall," she said. "We're here," Astrid said. "We're all here." Storm was beside her immediately, pressing against her legs, his warmth a solid reality in the cold air that had come in with them. She checked Emil's face. His cheeks were red, dangerously flushed, but not the white that meant real damage. She checked his hands, his feet. He was crying in earnest now, which was good. Children who are too cold stop crying. She wrapped him in every blanket she could reach and held him against her chest and felt the stove's heat begin to build in the room. And she rocked him and said things she had said to him since before he could understand words. Low sounds, rhythmic sounds, the particular language between a mother and her child that requires no translation. After a while, he stopped shaking. After a while, she did too. The storm announced itself through every surface of the soddy. The walls groaned. The window rattled in its frame. Snow found the gap beneath the door and crept in as a fine white line across the dirt floor. The chimney pipe screamed when the wind caught it at certain angles. A sound unlike anything else, high and metallic and almost human. and the fire began to struggle. Astrid had known, in theory, that extreme cold could overwhelm a stove, that the heat produced and the heat lost could reach a balance point that was not warm enough. She had not felt it happen before. She felt it now. The stove was burning. The bricks were glowing properly. But the heat was being taken as fast as it was made, pulled out through the walls and the window and the seam around the door, and the temperature in the room was dropping despite the fire. She fed more bricks, 2 at a time, then 3. The heat pulsed outward, stronger, but then the cold took it, and the room dropped again. She was fighting something much larger than herself. She knew it. She kept fighting anyway. And then, in the middle of the worst of it, Emil half asleep against her, Lena reading aloud from the Bible in a low, steady voice to cover the sound of the wind, Storm pressed against the base of the stove with his eyes closed. Astrid understood something. She had been burning wrong. Not wrong in quality, wrong in pattern. She had been burning carefully. 1 brick, let it establish, add another, conserve, ration. The method that worked on ordinary cold nights. But this was not an ordinary cold night. And the method that worked then could not work now. She needed mass. She needed a coal bed deep enough and hot enough to sustain itself against the cold that was pressing in from every direction. She opened the firebox and put in 3 bricks at once, not stacked but nested, fitting against each other so they created a single dense mass rather than separate burning surfaces. She left the damper open fully to let the fire breathe hard and build fast. For a terrible minute, nothing changed. Then the coal bed shifted and glowed whiter, and the heat came off the stove in a wave she could feel on her face from across the room. The room temperature steadied. It did not become warm, but it stopped falling. She thought, 45 minutes per brick, 3 bricks at a time. How many bricks in the corner stack? She counted. Enough. Barely enough. If she was careful about when she burned and when she let the coal bed sustain itself, if nothing else went wrong. She looked at Lena. Keep reading, she said. It helps. Lena kept reading. The first knock came hours later, when the dark was complete, and the storm had reached what seemed like its full voice, though it would get worse before it got better. She didn't know that yet. She thought for a moment that she had imagined it. The storm made sounds that resembled other sounds. She had already heard twice what sounded like someone calling her name, and both times it had been the wind catching the chimney pipe at a particular angle. But Storm's head came up. His ears moved forward. He stood and went to the door, and stood there. And that was not a response to wind. She opened the door against its drift of snow. Aldwin Holt stood in the darkness with his wife and his 3 children, and the oldest child was carrying the youngest, who was wrapped in every piece of clothing they had apparently been able to grab, and the child's face was visible at the top of the bundle, and it was a color that faces should not be. Aldwin said nothing. He looked at her. That was all. She stepped back. Come in, she said. Get warm. They came in like people who have stopped expecting things, with a dazed gratitude of the nearly lost, not quite believing in warmth until they were already inside it. The children went straight to the stove without being told. Storm moved among them, pressing his nose briefly against each child in turn, and the youngest, still that terrible color, was set down near the stove's base, and Storm lay down beside him, and the child's hand found the dog's fur and held it. Astrid was already assessing the fire situation. More people, more body heat. That helped. More people also meant the food supply and the water supply and the brick supply all recalculated. She did it fast, in her head, the way she had learned to do arithmetic in difficult conditions. Still enough. Differently enough. But enough. The second knock came while she was adjusting the damper. Rupert Fenn, alone, his hands already showing the waxy pallor of real cold damage. He did not speak when she opened the door. He looked at the room, at the warmth, at the people, at the bricks stacked in the corner. And something in his face did something she had not expected from him. Not shame, exactly. More like the expression of a man realizing that the architecture of his certainty has collapsed, and he is standing in the rubble. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." He came in. Then a family she knew only by sight. A man, a woman, 2 children. The mother carrying something in her arms that turned out to be a newborn. The smallest child Astrid had ever seen. Still so new to the world that its face had the squashed, uncertain quality of the very recently born. The mother's eyes were fixed and frightened. The particular fright of someone whose fear is not for themselves. Astrid took the child. She held it against her chest, inside her coat, and she felt it move, weakly but move. And she said to the mother, "Sit by the stove. Right there. Don't move." The mother sat. Storm went to her and leaned against her legs, and she put her hand on his back without looking down. The way you hold on to something when you are too frightened to do anything intentional. More came. A family from the north end of the valley. The grandmother who had watched Astrid from the window without expression. She came in leaning on her granddaughter, and when she passed through the doorway, she stopped and looked at Astrid with those same unreadable eyes and said nothing. But she nodded once with a weight that felt like more than greeting. The soddy filled. 14 people in a space built for 3. The walls held. The fire held. The coal bed she had built from 3 bricks layered and nested glowed at the heart of the stove like something that had decided to exist and meant it. And in the full dark of that terrible night, with the storm throwing itself against the walls, and the people of the valley pressed together in the warmth of what she had built, Astrid took the Bible down from the shelf and opened it to the front page and took out the note. She read it by firelight, not for the first time, but for the first time she read all of it, the whole of it, every word, including the last line she had somehow read past before. The line that had been there all along, waiting for exactly this moment. Trust the walls, and trust the people brave enough to knock. Not an instruction for the future. A record of a failure. The man who had lived here before her had written this because he had not been trusted when he knocked. Because no door had opened for him, because he had wanted whoever came next to understand what it cost, and to choose differently. She looked at the 14 people in her home, at the children pressed against Storm's sides, at Rupert Fenn sitting with his hands wrapped around a mug of hot water, looking at the floor with an expression she recognized as a man renegotiating something with himself. At Aldwin Holt, who had not looked at her since he came in, whose jaw was set in the way of someone who cannot yet find the words for what they are feeling. She folded the note and put it in her coat pocket, close to her chest. Not in the Bible this time. With her. She was still awake when the wind began, very slightly, to change its pitch. Not softer, not yet, but different. The way a sound changes when the thing making it has reached its limit and is beginning, however slowly, to exhaust itself. She sat by the stove and added bricks, one at a time now, carefully, and she looked at the people sleeping around her on the floor, and on the cot, and in the corner where Storm had organized himself as a pillow for 3 separate children. And she thought about what the man before her had written. The earth holds heat if you let it. She understood it completely now. All of it. Not just the walls, not just the insulation and the coal beds and the compressed fuel she had made from weeds that everyone told her would never work. The heat in this room was not coming only from the stove. It was coming from 14 bodies in a small space, from Storm's warmth distributed among the children, from the shared breath and shared survival of people who had, hours ago, been enemies and skeptics and strangers. That was what he had meant. That was what he had tried to tell her from the beginning. The earth holds heat if you let it. She let it. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, 14 people breathed and slept and held on to each other in the dark. And the walls of a soddy built by a dead man's hands and maintained by a woman who refused to be afraid held every degree of warmth they were given and did not let go. The night had weight, not the weight of the storm, though the storm was still there, still throwing itself against the walls, still filling every gap with sound. The weight Astrid felt was different. It was the weight of 14 people breathing in a space built for 3, the weight of bodies pressed close together on a dirt floor, the weight of survival happening in real time all around her while she sat by the stove and kept the fire and did not sleep. She had assigned herself this watch. No one had asked her to. But someone had to count the bricks and manage the burn rate and watch the faces of the people around her for the particular stillness that meant a body was losing its fight with cold, and she was the only one in the room who knew how to read all 3. She moved quietly, the way she had learned to move in the months since Henrik died, with the particular economy of a person who has no margin for wasted effort. She checked the firebox. She added a brick, then another, nesting them the way she had learned would build the coal bed rather than just burning surface. She adjusted the damper by a fraction. She watched the heat spread. Rupert Fenn's hands were the most serious problem. He had come in with the waxy pallor of genuine cold damage, fingers white from the second joint down, the skin losing the argument with temperature that the body fights in stages. She had seen it before, briefly, in a winter back home, and she remembered what her grandmother had done. Not heat, not rubbing, not the instinctive impulse to warm the thing quickly that causes more harm than the cold itself. She melted snow slowly in the smallest pot she had, warming it to the temperature of a mild afternoon, not hot, not scalding. She brought it to Fenn without comment and set it in front of him. He looked at it, then at her. "Put your hands in," she said. "Slowly. Don't rub them." He did what she said. The expression on his face as the feeling began to return was not one she had expected from him. It was stripped of everything he usually wore, all the commercial confidence and studied certainty, and what was underneath was simply a man in pain who was grateful to be warm. She left him there and went back to the stove. The grandmother from the north end, the one with the unreadable eyes, watched everything Astrid did from her place against the wall, not suspiciously, more the way very old people sometimes watch, as if they are collecting evidence for a judgment they have not yet rendered. After a while, she spoke. Her voice was low, accented with something from another continent, another life. "My husband's mother taught me the same thing," she said, "about the hands, not too fast. My grandmother, Astrid said. The old woman nodded slowly. The grandmothers knew things, she said. The granddaughters are still learning which things were true. She said nothing more. But something in the room shifted slightly, some quality of the air between them. And Astrid understood she had been weighed and found, if not entirely adequate, at least honest. The children slept in layers. Lena had organized them with the quiet authority she brought to everything. Her own siblings closest to the stove, then the other children arranged by size and apparent need, the littlest ones near Storm, who lay in the center of the arrangement like a furnace of his own, his breathing steady and his body warm in the way of dogs who have spent their whole lives outdoors and carry the cold the way water carries salt. As something incorporated, not something that defeats them. Aldwin Holt's son, the 7-year-old boy who had not spoken since he came in, was still pressed against Storm's side. He had not spoken. He had not cried. He had simply held on to the dog's fur with both hands and kept his eyes open in the careful way of a child who has decided that sleep is not safe. Astrid had watched him. She knew that kind of stillness. She had worn it herself in the weeks after Henrik died, when the grief was too large to cry, and the fear was too present to sleep, and the only thing you could do was keep your hands busy and your eyes open and wait for the world to become navigable again. She did not try to speak to him. She had learned in those weeks that speech was not always what stillness needed. Storm knew it too. Storm had always known. The dog had not moved from the boy's side since the family arrived. He lay there with a patience that seemed almost deliberate, as if he had understood what was needed and appointed himself to the task. The boy's hands in his fur, the warmth moving between them, the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing, which was slower and more regular than a child's, and had, in Astrid's observation, a kind of organizing effect on people who were too frightened to breathe properly themselves. It was deep in the night, the hour that feels furthest from morning in both directions, when the boy's hands loosened their grip slightly, not releasing, just easing. The desperate clutch softening into something that was still contact but no longer quite emergency. And then, in a voice so quiet that Astrid almost didn't hear it over the wind, "Can I keep petting the dog?" The room changed. It was not loud. Nobody moved dramatically. But something happened in the air of that small soddy that Astrid would carry with her for the rest of her life. A quality of collective held breath releasing, of 14 people exhaling something they had been holding without knowing it. Aldwin Holt, who was sitting with his back against the east wall and his knees drawn up and his face arranged in the expression of a man doing difficult internal accounting, turned toward the wall. His shoulders moved once. Then he was still. His wife reached over and put her hand on his arm. He did not shake it off. Astrid looked away from both of them and fed another brick to the fire, because some moments are private even when they happen in crowded rooms, and the most respectful thing a witness can do is tend to something else. "Yes," she said to the boy, to Storm, to the room, "you can keep petting the dog." Storm's tail moved once, slowly, as if even that much expression required conservation. Sometime in the middle of the night, Emil's fever broke. He had been running hot since the cold first entered the soddy, his face flushed, his breathing faster than she liked, his small body working hard against something Astrid couldn't name and could only watch. She had kept him close, pressed against her side, monitoring with the particular attention of a mother who has learned that the body communicates in temperatures and rhythms if you know how to listen. She felt it happen, a shift in the quality of his heat. Not the dry fever heat, but something wetter, the particular warmth of a body that has won its argument and is returning to itself. He stirred and pressed his face harder into her shoulder and made a sound that was not quite a word, but was not quite distress either. More like a sound of simple location, of a small creature confirming it is still where it is supposed to be. She put her lips against his forehead. Normal. Or near enough. She closed her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. The grief that moved through her then was not grief exactly. It was the thing that lives on the other side of fear when fear releases, the shaking aftermath of sustained terror. And she let it move through her quietly, in the dark, without letting it into her face. Then she opened her eyes and checked the fire and counted the remaining bricks and calculated the hours until morning. Still enough. In the deep of the night, when the storm had reached what might have been its worst, the walls flexing slightly under the pressure of the wind, the chimney pipes screaming at intervals, the snow so thick against the window that the glass had become a white wall. Astrid became aware that she was not alone in her waking. Ezra was sitting with his back against the south wall, his long legs stretched in front of him, his eyes open. He had been there, she realized, for some time, watching. Not her, exactly. Watching the room the way she was watching it. The quiet, systematic attention of someone who has taken responsibility for something and won't put it down until it's safe. Their eyes met. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. But he moved over slightly, making a space against the wall beside him, and she went and sat there because her legs had been aching for an hour and the stove was close enough to tend from this position. The wall was warm against her back, the earth holding its heat, even now, even in this. After a while he said, very quietly, so as not to wake anyone, "You were right, about the sky. Yes, Silas will know that." "Silas will know it," she said. "That's different from saying it." Ezra considered this. With Silas, knowing is most of it. The saying comes later, or it doesn't. But the knowing changes things. She thought about Silas Greer, alone in his house on the far edge of the valley, with his 11 winters and his 2 buried wives and his arithmetic. She thought about the flicker she had seen in his face when she told him the sky was wrong. That moment of something that might have been recognition. And she hoped that he had seen it too. She hoped he had believed her even a little, enough to add wood to his fire, enough to fill a pot with water before dark. She hoped he was warm. She would not know until morning. There was nothing to do about it until morning. So she sat with her back against the warm wall and kept the fire and did not sleep. And beside her, Ezra kept his own watch in the companionable silence of 2 people who understand that some things don't require words. At one point, Storm got up from the children, walked across the sleeping bodies with the careful precision of a large dog in a small space, stepping over legs, around hands, between the bundled sleeping forms of people he had only met hours ago, and came to lie down at Astrid's feet. He turned twice, settled, and put his head on her boot. Ezra looked down at him. "He knows who's steering," he said. "He knows who needs the company," she said. He looked at her then, a look she recognized as the kind that is collecting something for later, something to be thought about when there is time for thought. She didn't look away. There was no reason to. After a while, his hand found hers on the floor between them. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. But she turned her hand over and his fingers were cold, and she held them, and the warmth moved between them the way warmth does when you let it. The earth holds heat if you let it. She let it. When the first pale light began at the edge of the window, not the white of storm, but the gray of approaching dawn, a different quality of dark giving way to a different quality of light. Astrid heard the wind change. It happened over the course of perhaps an hour. A gradual modulation, the screaming pitches dropping out first, leaving only the lower registers, and then those too beginning to lose their edge. By the time the window had moved from white to pale gray, the wind had dropped to something that could be called wind again, rather than force. The storm was not over, but it had passed its worst. She felt it in the walls. The soddy had been absorbing pressure all night, braced against a weight that had been trying, steadily, to unmake it. Now that pressure eased and the walls settled back into themselves with a series of small sounds that were not alarm, but relief. People began to wake. It happened in the way waking always happens in crowded spaces. One person stirs, and their movement travels through the connected warmth of bodies pressed together, and someone else shifts, and a child makes a sound, and suddenly the room that had been sleeping is in the process of not sleeping anymore. The first thing most of them did was look at Astrid. She was at the stove. She had been at the stove or near it all night. She was adding the morning's first bricks, building the coal bed for the day ahead, her movements the same as they had been every morning since she arrived on this land. Deliberate, unhurried, shaped by months of practice into something that looked almost effortless. The grandmother watched her. Then the old woman said something quietly to Aldwin Holt's wife beside her. The wife looked at Astrid. Then she stood up carefully and came to the stove. "Tell me what needs doing," the woman said. Astrid looked at her. "Water. The pots by the window. Heat them slowly." She did. Others followed. Not immediately, and not all of them, but in the organic way of people who have survived something together and are beginning to understand what that means. Aldwin's oldest child, a girl of perhaps 10, went to Lena without prompting, and the two of them began to organize the blankets, folding, stacking, creating order from the tangled evidence of the night. Emil woke and surveyed the room with the frank curiosity of a 3-year-old who has slept through most of the drama and is now presented with an inexplicable number of people in his house. "Why are there so many people?" he asked. "Because it was cold," Lena told him. Emil considered this. "Are they going to stay?" "Not forever," Lena said. "Storm could stay," Emil said. Storm, hearing his name, thumped his tail without opening his eyes. The boy, Aldwin's son, was awake. He was still where he had been all night, but his posture had changed. The terrible rigidity was gone. He was sitting up now, one hand still resting on Storm's back, watching the room with eyes that were tired but present. Lena sat beside him without ceremony. She opened the Bible, Henrik's Bible, which she had been reading from the night before, and ran her finger along a line of text. "Can you read?" she asked. He shook his head. "I'll teach you," she said. "It's not hard. You just have to learn the sounds." She turned the book so he could see it and pointed to the first letter of the first word. He leaned slightly forward. Just slightly. Just enough. Astrid, watching from across the room, thought, "There it is. There is the thing that does not break." She turned back to the stove before her face could do what it wanted to do. Rupert Fenn's hands had color again. He was sitting where she had left him, though he had shifted some time in the night to give a sleeping child more room, and he was holding the mug she had given him, empty now, long empty, and looking at it. When she brought him a fresh cup of hot water, he took it and held it in both hands and looked up at her. She expected something complicated, an explanation, a justification. The kind of language people use when they need to reframe a position without quite admitting it was wrong. "My barometer," he said. "I looked at it again after you left. It was lower than I said." She waited. "I knew," he said. "Not for certain, but enough to wonder. I chose not to wonder." He turned the mug slowly between his palms. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." "Because it's true," she said, "and you're tired of carrying things that are true." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the mug. Then he nodded once, as if something had been confirmed. She left him there. She had more water to heat and more people to check, and a coal bed to maintain, and one conversation, however honest, did not change what needed doing. Mid-morning, the wind dropped to silence. It happened suddenly, the way the storm had arrived. One moment the world was sound and motion. The next, it was not. The silence after that kind of storm has a quality unlike ordinary quiet. It is not peaceful. It is stunned. The world standing very still while it takes stock of what just happened. Astrid opened the door. The light was blinding. Snow everywhere, reflecting everything. The sun coming off the white surface with an intensity that had nothing gentle in it. The storm had sculpted the landscape into new shapes, drifts where there had been flat ground where drifts had been the day before. The south wall's brick stack was buried to half its height. The well had a cap of hard-packed snow that would need to be dug out. She looked out at all of it for a long moment. Then she looked up. The sky was clear, completely, totally clear. The kind of blue that only exists after something violent has swept everything else away. She stepped out alone, just for a moment, into the cold and the silence and the blinding white. She stood in the snow up to her shins, and she looked at the sky, and she breathed. The grief came then, the real grief, the kind she had been holding back all night through the work of keeping 14 people alive. It did not announce itself. It simply arrived, the way grief does when you finally stop moving long enough for it to catch you. Henrik, who had believed in this land, who had not lived to see it. The man before her, whose name she still didn't know, who had written on a piece of paper and left it under a floorboard for whoever came next, who had knocked on doors that did not open and survived it anyway and left. The old man who lived alone at the end of the road. She had not been able to reach him. She did not know, yet, what had become of him. She was afraid she already knew. She stood in the snow and let the grief move through her, all the way through. And she looked at the sky until her eyes adjusted and the blue stopped being blinding and became simply what it was. The sky after a storm, vast and cold and entirely indifferent and completely, unreservedly beautiful. Storm pushed through the door behind her and came to stand beside her. He looked up at her face. Then he looked at the horizon. Then his tail moved. Not the full enthusiasm of ordinary dog happiness, but a slow, deliberate wave. "Here," it said. "Still here." She put her hand on his head. "Yes," she said, to him, to Henrik, to the man whose name she didn't know, to the open sky. "Still here." Lena appeared in the doorway, Emil behind her, and behind Emil the boy, Aldwin's son, standing just at the threshold, looking at the white world outside with an expression Astrid recognized, the expression of someone deciding whether the outside is safe again. Lena looked at her mother. "Emil wants to know if the snow is for playing in," she said. "Not yet," Astrid said, "but soon." Emil accepted this with philosophical equanimity and went back inside. The boy stayed in the doorway a moment longer, looking at Storm, who had moved a few feet away and was standing in the snow with his nose tilted up, reading the changed air. "He knew it was coming," the boy said. Not a question. "Yes," Astrid said. "How?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about grandmothers and notes under floorboards and bricks made from weeds that everyone said wouldn't burn, and the way certain knowledge lives in the body and in the old things and in the creatures that pay attention to what people are too busy to notice. "Some things," she said carefully, "you know without knowing how you know. You just have to be paying attention." The boy looked at Storm for another moment. Then he looked at Astrid. "My father said your bricks wouldn't work," he said. "I know. They worked." "Yes." He seemed to be turning something over in his mind. Then, "Will you teach me how to make them?" She looked at this boy, this child who had sat mute all night, gripping a dog's fur like a lifeline, and who had now decided that the world outside the doorway was safe enough to ask questions in. "Yes," she said. "Come out here, and I'll show you where the sunflowers are." He came out. He sank into the snow past his knees and said nothing about it. He stood beside her and looked at the dead stalks still visible above the drifts, hundreds of them, brown against the white. "There are so many," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's the thing about them. Everyone thought they were nothing, just weeds, just something in the way." She looked at the field of them, stretching to the fence line and beyond. "It turns out they were exactly what we needed all along. We just hadn't learned to see them right." He was quiet for a moment. "My father called your house folly," he said. "I know." He was wrong. "People are wrong sometimes," she said. "That doesn't make them bad. It just means they were working with what they knew." He looked at her sidelong, a child's look, assessing, direct in the way that children are direct when they have decided to trust someone. "Are you going to tell him that?" "Your father?" "Yes." Astrid thought about Aldwin Holt sitting against the wall with his shoulders turned and his jaw set and his wife's hand on his arm. She thought about what it costs a man like that to knock on a door he had called folly. She thought about 14 people breathing together through the worst night this valley had seen in years, and the boy's voice in the dark asking about the dog, and Rupert Fenn's hands in warm water. "I don't need to tell him anything," she said. "He already knows." The boy considered this. Then he looked at the sunflowers again. "Okay," he said. "Show me how to cut them." She showed him. She showed him how to find the stalks that had the right density, not the thin ones that would burn too fast, not the ones that had rotted at the base, but the solid ones, the ones that rang like wood when you knocked them together. She showed him how to cut them at the base and stack them so they didn't tangle. She showed him the ratio she had worked out over months of experimentation. How much mud, how much dry grass for binding, how tight to pack the press. He listened. He remembered. He asked the right questions. Behind them, in the soddy, the 14 people Astrid had kept alive through the night were beginning, slowly and carefully, to figure out what came next. That was the other side of surviving. You had to figure out what came next. But Astrid was starting to think. Standing in the snow with this boy who had been silent and was now asking questions, with Storm moving through the drifts around them, sniffing at everything with the focused joy of a dog discovering a new world. She was starting to think that what came next was not going to be as hard as what had already passed. Not because the work was done. The work was never done. There would be more bricks to make and more cold to endure, and more people who would need to be shown that what looked like weeds could be warmth, that what looked like nothing could be enough, that the things handed down from grandmothers and dead men under floorboards were not lesser knowledge, but older knowledge. And older was not the same as wrong. But she had kept 14 people alive through the worst night in the valley's memory, with bricks made from plants that grew wild along every fence line, with walls built from earth and grass, and the stubbornness of a woman who had nowhere else to go. Silas Greer had done the arithmetic. His arithmetic had not accounted for the sunflowers. She was still thinking about this, about arithmetic and what it leaves out, when Emil appeared in the doorway again. "Mama," he said, "the lady inside is crying." She looked toward the door. "Which lady?" "The one with the baby." He paused. "But good crying. Lena says there's good crying and bad crying, and this is the good kind." Astrid looked at the boy beside her. He was looking at the sunflower stalks with an expression of serious calculation, already planning something. "Go inside," she told him. "Get warm. We'll do more tomorrow." He went. She stood for one more moment in the snow, looking at the sky. That impossible clear blue. That sky that had no memory of what had just happened, or perhaps had all the memory in the world and simply kept it differently than people did. Then she went inside to see about the good crying. The earth holds heat if you let it. She was letting it. The valley looked different after the storm. Not destroyed exactly. The land was too old and too patient for that word, but rearranged, humbled. The things that had seemed permanent before the storm, the fence lines, the familiar shapes of rooftops, the particular way the light fell across the grass at certain hours, all of it had been picked up and set back down at slightly wrong angles, like furniture moved by someone who didn't know the room. The people who came out of the soddy into that rearranged world were different too. They came out slowly, one by one, blinking in the hard winter light. They stood in the snow and looked at what remained of their properties across the valley, and their faces did the complicated work of people calculating loss and relief simultaneously, grateful to be standing, grieving what they were standing to look at. Astrid let them look. She stayed near the door and watched and did not rush anyone toward anything. There would be time for the practical work. The digging out, the assessment of damage, the long labor of restoring what could be restored. That would come. But the first moments after surviving something belonged to the surviving, and she had learned not to interrupt them. Aldwin Holt was the last to come out. He stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping into the snow, his hand on the door frame, looking at the sky with an expression she couldn't fully read from where she stood. Then he stepped out and walked to where she was and stopped. He did not look at her immediately. He looked at the wall of bricks along the south side of the soddy. What remained visible above the drifts, the brown shapes packed tight and neat, the work of months that had held through the night and come out the other side still standing. "I called this Folly House," he said. "Yes." "I was wrong." She waited. He had more to say. She could see it in the way he was holding himself, the effort of a man assembling words that don't come naturally to him. "I was wrong," he said again, "about the bricks, about what you were doing, about—" He stopped, started again. "My boy didn't speak for hours last night. He hasn't been right since his grandfather died, 2 seasons back. He stopped talking to most people." He paused. "He talked to your daughter this morning, asked her to teach him more letters." Astrid said nothing. "That's because of you," Aldwin said. "All of it. The warmth. The way things were in there last night." He finally looked at her directly. His eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from cold or something else she couldn't say. "I don't have the right words for what I want to say." "You don't need the right words," she said. "You're saying it." He nodded once, a sharp downward motion. Then he looked at the wall of bricks again. "Will you teach me how to make them?" "Come by when the ground is clear enough to work," she said. "Bring your boy." He nodded again and went to join his wife, who was standing further out in the snow looking at the direction of their property, calculating what they were going home to. His hand found the small of her back, and she leaned into him slightly without looking away from the horizon, and Astrid turned to give them that privacy too. The morning passed in the labor of aftermath. People dug paths through the drifts. They shared what food Astrid had remaining, thin, carefully rationed, but hot, which mattered more than quantity in the first hours after cold. The grandmother with the unreadable eyes turned out to have a practical authority that emerged naturally in emergency. She organized the distribution of food with the efficiency of someone who had done it before under worse circumstances, and nobody questioned her, which told Astrid something about what the old woman had survived before she ever came to this valley. Rupert Fenn helped dig. He did it without being asked, taking a shovel from the small shed without ceremony and working steadily on the path between the soddy and the well. He was not a man built for that kind of labor. His hands, still recovering, made it harder. But he worked carefully and did not stop and did not complain. At one point he came to where Astrid was working on the water supply and stood beside her for a moment. "I'll be reducing my prices," he said, not looking at her, looking at the shovel in his hands. "For coal, for those who can't afford the winter rate." She looked at him. "It's not generosity," he said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. I looked at what you've been doing here, and I understand now that there are people in this valley who've been going without because of what I charge. That's a thing I can change." He paused. "So I'm changing it." "That's more than most people do," she said. "Change a thing they can change." He looked at her then, a direct look, the kind that costs something. "The barometer," he said. I knew what it said. "I know. I'm going to have to live with that." "Yes," she said. "But you opened the door last night. You were brave enough to knock. That counts for something." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went back to digging, and she went back to the water, and neither of them said anything more about it, because some things are better left in the space between acknowledgement and forgiveness, rather than pressed all the way into either. The old man at the end of the road. She found out mid-morning When Callum Reed came from the north end of the valley on horseback, he had ridden out at first light to check on neighbors, and stopped at the soddy to deliver his report of who was accounted for. Everyone was accounted for, mostly. The old man who lived alone at the end of the far road, the one she had not been able to reach in time, had gone out in the early hours of the storm to check on his animals, to do the thing that old men who have always managed alone cannot stop themselves from doing even when they should. He had not come back. Callum told her this quietly, standing outside the soddy door with his hat in his hands. She heard it and was still for a moment. Just a moment. Then she thanked him and went inside and stood at the stove and let the grief move through her cleanly. She had not known the old man well, had passed his property on her early trips through the valley, had seen him at the trading post once, had tried to reach him the morning of the storm and been a mile too short. She had done what she could do. She had not been able to do enough. Those two things were both true, and they did not cancel each other out, and she would carry both of them. Later, when the snow had settled enough to move through, she took a bundle of dried sunflowers. Not bricks, just flowers, the ones she had kept in a jar on the shelf through the whole winter. And she walked to the old man's property and stood at the edge of it and set the flowers in the snow. She didn't say anything. She didn't know what words were right for a man whose name she had never learned and whose story had ended before she understood it was connected to hers. She stood there for a while in the cold and let the silence be what it was. Then she went home. Silas Greer came the following week. She had not expected him. She had told herself she had not expected him, and she had believed herself, right up until she saw his horse coming down the trail, and felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched. He came alone. He tied his horse at the post and walked to where she was working at the press. The first good pressing day since the storm. The ground hard enough to work, but the air still and clear. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the wall of bricks, at the press, at her hands, which were cracked from months of work and cold and work again. He was quiet for a long time. Silas Greer was always quiet before he said things. She had come to understand that the quiet was not evasion. It was the work of a man who believes that words should be accurate before they are spoken. The sky was wrong that morning, he said. Yes. I saw what you saw. I chose not to act on it. She kept working the press. You're here now, she said. That's not nothing. He reached into the coat he was wearing, heavy wool, the coat of a man who understood winters. And he took out something she didn't immediately recognize. A piece of iron, old, shaped with some purpose she couldn't determine from looking at it. Part of a press mechanism, he said. Old design. I've had it for years. Never knew what to do with it. He set it on the edge of the press frame. Thought you might find a use. She looked at it. It was a ratchet piece. She could see immediately how it would allow the lever to hold position without slipping, how it would let her apply pressure with one hand while adjusting the brick form with the other. Months of small frustration with the press, solved in a piece of iron that had been sitting in Silas Greer's barn for years. She picked it up. She looked at him. Thank you, she said. He touched the brim of his hat. He turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted with the careful deliberateness of an older man who has made peace with the fact that his body now requires more negotiation than it used to. He paused before he rode away. The bricks worked, he said. Not quite a concession, not quite an apology. Something more precise than either. An acknowledgement of fact from a man who respected facts above all other things. Yes, she said. He rode away. She looked at the ratchet piece in her hand for a moment, and then she fitted it to the press, and it worked exactly as she had thought it would, and she thought that this was perhaps how Silas Greer said the things he couldn't say with words, with a piece of iron from his barn, with the ride across a valley in the cold, with a pause before riding away. It was enough. It was more than enough. The weeks that followed were a different kind of work. People came to learn, not all at once, not with any formal announcement, but the story of the night had traveled through the valley the way stories travel in small places, carried by the people who had been there, shaped slightly differently in each retelling, but consistent in its essential facts. A woman had built warmth from weeds. She had kept the door open. 14 people had come through. Callum Reed was first, bringing his family on a clear morning, carrying questions he had obviously been composing for some time. She showed him everything she had shown herself through months of trial. The stalks, the selection, the press, the drying, the ratio of mud to material, the way to build the coal bed for maximum sustained heat. He took notes on a folded piece of paper with a stub of pencil. He drew diagrams. He asked the right questions, the questions of someone who wants to understand the principle, not just copy the action. So the heat comes from the density, he said. The density lets the fire build inward instead of racing outward, she said. It's the difference between a fire and a furnace. He looked at the note he had written. That's worth writing down properly, so people can learn it even if they can't come here. Write it down, then. He did. He came back 2 weeks later with a sheet of paper covered in neat, careful text. The method described step by step, the materials, the ratios, the common failures, and how to avoid them. He had added a drawing of the press. He had added a note at the top that said, "Learned from A. Voss, who learned it from necessity, which is a good teacher." She read it. She made 2 corrections. She handed it back. "Make as many copies as you need," she said. A young woman named Rila Thorne came on a gray afternoon, riding alone, wearing a coat that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to identify. She was perhaps 16, with the particular composure of a young person who has recently suffered something large and is still deciding what to do with the weight of it. She had lost her grandfather in the storm. He had been at the far edge of the valley, too far for anyone to reach in time. She had been the one to find him. She sat at Astrid's table and drank hot water and did not cry, which told Astrid that she had already done her crying somewhere private and was now doing the harder thing of figuring out how to carry what was left. "He always said the old ways weren't worth keeping," Rila said, "that you had to learn the new things or get left behind." She looked at the bricks stacked in the corner. But the new things didn't work that night. The coal ran out. The new stoves cracked, and everyone who survived did it with things people had known how to do a long time ago. "The old ways and the new ways aren't enemies," Astrid said. "They just have different uses. You have to know which one you're reaching for." Rilla looked at her. "Will you teach me?" "What do you want to learn?" "Everything," the girl said simply. So Astrid taught her. She taught her the press and the bricks and the way to read a coal bed. She taught her about the south wall and the insulation depth, and what the man under the floorboard had worked out with his diagrams. She taught her the things her grandmother had taught her, about hands in warm water and breathing slowly, and the difference between the cold that can be survived and the cold that cannot. She taught her what Storm had taught her about paying attention to the things that pay attention to what you don't. Rilla learned quickly, with the focused appetite of someone who has decided to make knowledge a kind of memorial. She came back again and again. She brought others, younger siblings, neighbors' children, a woman from the North End who had 3 small children and no husband, and a look in her eyes that Astrid recognized as her own face in a mirror from months ago. She taught them all. She asked nothing in return. She had not invented warmth. She had learned what was already there. The least she could do was keep passing it forward. Ezra came by on a Tuesday. It was not a pressing day or a teaching day, or any day that required him to be there for any practical reason. He came with a piece of rope he said might be useful for the drying rack, and a question he had clearly been preparing, which he delivered while fixing the rope to the rack hooks with more care than the task required. "I have a farm that's too quiet," he said to the hook he was tying. "And you have children who have too much to do for one person to manage alone." A pause. Those 2 situations seem like they might have a solution that benefits both. Astrid was working the press and did not stop working it. "That's a very practical way to put something," she said. "I'm a practical man." "I've noticed." He finished with the hook and turned around. He looked at her with the directness he brought to everything, the same directness that had made him drive up with a better press months ago without much explanation, that had made him sit awake all night watching 14 people sleep, that had made him take her hand in the dark and not let go until morning. "I lost someone," he said. "A long time ago. I thought for a long time that losing someone meant you shouldn't try again, that trying again was disloyal somehow, or foolish, or asking for something you had no right to ask for." He paused. "I've changed my mind about that." She stopped working the press. She looked at him, at the lines in his face that were the map of a long life and a hard one and a good one, at his hands that had fixed things that weren't broken and carried a heavy press across a cold valley because he wanted to see someone succeed, at the steadiness in him that had been there from the beginning, that particular quality of a person who has survived enough to know what matters and has organized themselves accordingly. "Lena already knows," she said. He blinked. "Knows what?" "She told Storm weeks ago that she thought you'd ask eventually." Astrid looked at the press, then back at him. "Emil doesn't know yet, but he'll be in favor of anything that increases the number of people who live here and might give him attention." The corners of his mouth moved. "And you?" She thought about Henrik, who had believed in this land. She thought about the note under the floorboard, and the man whose name she never knew, and what it means to keep building something after the person who believed in it most is gone. She thought about warmth and how it passes from one person to the next if you let it, and about doors and what it costs to open them, and about the arithmetic of loss and whether it ever really balances. She picked up the next bundle of stalks and began feeding them into the press. "Ask me properly," she said, "and I'll give you a proper answer." He laughed, a real laugh, quiet and surprised, the laugh of a man who has forgotten he can still be caught off guard by something good. Then he came and stood across the press from her and looked at her with the seriousness that was always underneath the quiet. "Astrid Voss," he said, "I am not a man of many words, and I am 63 years old, and my farm is too quiet, and I would very much like to spend whatever winters I have left being useful to someone who knows how to use help well." She kept working the press. The stalks compressed under the lever. The brick formed. "Yes," she said, "that'll do." The wedding was small, which was the only kind of wedding that made sense in a valley still digging out from winter. Widow Brandt came with a loaf of bread she had been saving a particular jar of preserves for. The grandmother with the unreadable eyes came and sat in the corner and watched everything with an expression that had finally resolved into something recognizable. Approval. Callum Reed came with his family, and Aldwyn Holt came with his wife and his boy. And the boy brought Lena a stone he had found in the creek bed that had a vein of something bright running through it, and he gave it to her with the grave ceremony of a child delivering something important. Rilla Thorne came and stood at the back and cried, which she had apparently decided was acceptable indoors. Storm wore a piece of ribbon that Emil had tied to his collar, the result of extensive negotiation between Emil and Lena about what color was suitable. Storm bore the ribbon with dignity. Silas Greer did not come, but 2 days later, a sack of oats appeared on the doorstep, enough to last 2 months, the good kind, the kind that cost something. No note, no explanation. Astrid looked at it for a moment. Then she brought it inside. The seasons turned. Winter became a hard gray spring, then a late green summer, then an autumn that smelled of dry grass and coming cold, and the particular sweetness of sunflowers going to seed. Astrid moved through those seasons with Ezra beside her, and the work was still hard. It was always hard on the plains. That was the nature of the bargain. But hard and alone are different things, and she had stopped being alone. Lena grew. She grew the way children grow when they are learning things that matter, not just in height, but in the particular quality of her attention, which became more precise and more patient and more generous all at once. She taught reading to 4 children that year, including Aldwyn's boy, who turned out to have a gift for it that surprised everyone except Lena, who had known from the first morning when she showed him the letters and watched his eyes. Emil grew in the way Emil grew, loudly, sideways, with enormous enthusiasm and minimal caution. He broke 2 things a week on average and fixed one of them, which Ezra said was about the right ratio for a boy his age. He had appointed himself Storm's official keeper, which mostly meant that Storm now had more ribbon tied to various parts of him than any dog in the valley. Rilla Thorne took the written instructions Callum Reed had composed and copied them, carefully, in her own hand, adding to them as she learned more, correcting small errors, expanding the diagrams. By the following winter, she had taught the method to 11 families. By the winter after that, she had stopped counting and started teaching others to teach it, which she said was more efficient. The knowledge spread the way warmth spreads, from one hand to the next, in no particular order, not following the paths you'd expect, finding the places where it was needed. Storm grew old. It happened slowly, the way it always happens, the way you don't notice it happening until one day you look and understand that you have been not noticing it for longer than you thought. His muzzle went gray first, then the fur around his eyes. He moved more carefully, not painfully, not yet, just with the deliberateness of a body that has stopped taking its own competence for granted. He still sat at the northwest wall when the weather was coming. He still lifted his head when someone was approaching before anyone else could hear hoofbeats. He still pressed himself against the children when they were frightened and against Astrid when she was quiet in the particular way that meant something was heavy. He still vested in her boot when she sat by the fire at night. One autumn afternoon, when the light was low and gold and the sunflowers along the fence line were heavy with seed and bending, Storm walked to his place by the stove. His place, the specific patch of floor he had claimed on his first night and returned to every night since. And he turned twice and lay down and did not get up again. He was not in distress. His breathing was easy. His eyes were open and calm, watching the room with the same steady attention he had brought to everything. Lena sat beside him. She did not speak. She put her hand on his side and felt his breathing slow, and she stayed there until it stopped. Emil cried, which he did not try to hide. Ezra sat down on the floor next to Lena and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him. And Astrid stood at the stove because she needed to be standing, and the grief in the room was real and present, and none of them were ashamed of it. They buried him the next morning, at the base of the south wall, where the bricks had held through the worst night the valley had ever seen. Lena found a piece of flat wood and asked Ezra to help her with the letters, and together they made a small marker and set it in the ground. He knew before the barometer did. Astrid read it. She thought about the morning with the too blue sky and the dog who wouldn't eat and the doors that no one opened fast enough. She thought about all the things Storm had known before she did, before any of them did, and how he had tried, in his way, to tell them. She put her hand flat against the south wall. The earth underneath was cold with the season, but the wall itself, thick and packed and built to the depth that the diagram under the floorboard had specified, held a trace of warmth even now. The earth holds heat if you let it. She let it. Many years passed. The kind of years that are hard to count from the inside, that only resolve into number when you stand back and look at what has accumulated. The children grown, the farm larger, the knowledge spread further than she had ever thought to track. Lena became a teacher. Not in the way the word is usually used. She did not have a school building, at least not at first. She had a habit of sitting down with whoever needed to learn something and teaching them, and over time this habit formalized itself into something others depended on. She taught letters and numbers and the pressed fuel method and the management of cold, and she had her mother's quality of making knowledge feel like something found rather than delivered. Emil built things. He had always built things. Had always been the child taking apart what was broken and putting it back together in a configuration that was sometimes better and sometimes more interesting. He became, over time, the person people called when they needed something constructed or repaired or rethought from the ground up. He had Ezra's patience with materials and Astrid's stubbornness about problems and his own considerable gift for seeing how things fit together. Rilla Thorne eventually committed the pressed fuel method to a proper written document, thorough, clear, with illustrations and explanations for different types of prairie vegetation that could be similarly processed. She distributed it to anyone who asked and charged nothing, because Astrid had charged nothing, and some principles, once established, deserved to be kept. The valley changed. All valleys change. But the knowledge stayed, not in documents only, but in the particular way the older families built their south walls, and in the habit of watching dogs when the weather was uncertain, and in the small ritual observed in several households without anyone remembering exactly how it started, of keeping a bundle of dried sunflowers through the winter and setting them out in spring. An act of memory, a way of saying, we know what this is, we know what it can do. Astrid grew old in the soddy, not the original soddy. Over the years, Ezra had built additions, improved the structure, added a proper window and a solid floor. But the core of it remained. Those 3-foot walls, that south-facing room, the particular quality of quiet that existed inside them even when the wind was up. She sat on the low bench by the door one autumn evening, watching the last light move across the sunflower field. The flowers were past their peak, heads heavy and drooping, the petals mostly gone, the stalks beginning their long drying toward what they would become. A granddaughter sat beside her, a girl of perhaps 8, who had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's habit of sitting very still. "Tell me about the first winter," the girl said. It was not the first time she had asked. It was, in fact, something of a tradition. "Which part?" "The part where everyone said it couldn't work." Astrid looked at the sunflowers. She thought about 3 matches and a borrowed press, and a man she never met who had left her a diagram under a floorboard. She thought about Silas Greer's arithmetic and Aldwin Holt's apologetic eyes and Rupert Fenn's hands in warm water. She thought about Storm sitting at the northwest wall and a boy's voice in the dark asking about the dog and the weight of 14 people breathing together through the worst night the valley had ever seen. "Everyone said the stalks were weeds," she said. "They said weeds don't burn well enough to matter. They said one woman alone couldn't solve a problem that needed proper resources to solve. But she did," the girl said. "She did. Because she was strong?" Astrid considered this. "Because she was paying attention," she said. "Strength is useful, but attention is what tells you where to put it." The girl was quiet for a moment, watching the sunflowers move in the evening wind. "I want to learn," she said. "Everything you know." "Then come back tomorrow," Astrid said. "Bring your coat. We'll start with the press." The girl nodded. She leaned slightly against her grandmother's side, and Astrid put her arm around her, and they sat together in the last of the autumn light, while the sunflowers bowed and straightened and bowed again in the wind, the way they always had, patient and abundant and entirely indifferent to what anyone thought they were worth. The earth holds heat if you let it. She had let it. She had let it for a whole life. And here, in this moment, in the warmth between one old woman and one small girl, sitting at the edge of a field full of things everyone had once called weeds, the warmth was still here, still passing, still real, still enough.